So, Chris, last time I rather foolishly, in retrospect, said that I would explain the story of how the original Harvest Moon games that we just played are
Hmm.
actually in the Story of Seasons franchise, not the Harvest Moon franchise. I thought I understood the story when I said that, but I looked into it to more, and it's a bit more complicated than I thought, but I'm going to do my best. So, in Japan, Harvest Moon is
Uh-huh.
known as Bokujo Monogatari. Um, it is, it was renamed Harvest Moon here by the localization company Natsume, which is interesting. Natsume published and translated and made it different for Western audiences. And their name is all over the game, but they didn't actually make the game, which I guess is probably a normal thing, but it just seemed like that caused some confusion over the years that Natsume was not the creators of the game. So in 2014, the Japanese company, the developers that actually made the game, switched localization companies from Natsume to a
Oh,
company called Xseed. However,
okay.
Natsume owned Harvest Moon, the name, because that's the one they developed for their marketing, and so they kept the name, and instead, the formerly known as Harvest Moon games had to be rebranded under the Xseed publisher to Story of Seasons. Even when they remake older Harvest Moon games that are theirs, they own all the games, of course, because they made them. When they remake them, they have to rename them to Story of Seasons.
Except
But
for in this case, for I
uh,
mean, it's not a
well,
remake, but it's for the virtual consoles. It's okay.
that's a good question. Why those aren't? I
Have we
assume
been
just
playing the
because.
right games? What's been
Well, they still
happening?
have the Natsume name on it, so I assume both
Okay.
companies are profiting off of whatever Nintendo pays for the rights to host their old games. Um, to further complicate this story, Natsume, who owned the Harvest Moon name, was
Uh
like, "Well, we
huh.
have this valuable brand, and we don't have any games for it. Let's just make our own."
Uh
So
huh.
they started developing their own Harvest Moon games and branding them as Harvest Moon, even though it's a series that is brand new, effectively using the old name.
Well, why not?
And so, yeah, the anything named Harvest Moon from 2013 and earlier is a part of Story of Seasons. Anything named Harvest Moon at 2014 and later is a new
Is
franchise
part of
made
Harvest
by the
Moon,
original publisher of Harvest Moon.
right? But is actually called Harvest Moon,
Yeah,
not to
it's
be
called Harvest
confused with
Moon.
Harvest Moon, which is Story of
And
Seasons. Am I
and
getting that
of
correct?
note,
Uh huh.
I think so. And of note, the Story of Seasons games have pretty consistently reviewed better than the new Harvest Moon franchise. So a little bit of buyer beware when you look at currently releasing Harvest Moon games. I don't think they're necessarily bad, but they're of a lower quality and less experienced
Sure.
farming sim team. So uh, a lot of this is thanks to a someone named Gamma on YouTube. I'll send Chris the link to a more detailed story if that interests you.
I feel like you needed
But
a flowchart for
that's kind of the
this.
summary. Indeed, except the arrows would be going a lot of directions.
Still, that's half the fun of flowcharts. I mean,
So any questions? Please say no. Please say no.
many, but I'm not going to ask them. Two brothers play a game. Two brothers play a game. Two brothers play a game. Then they will rate that game.
Welcome to Two Brothers Play a Game. I'm Josh.
I'm Chris and confused.
Well, I figured that was a good enough place to end. Uh, any which way, this is a podcast where we two brothers play a game we found on sale for Nintendo Switch, except that currently we are playing titles from the Nintendo Switch Online Expansion Pass library. Ooh, that's always a mouthful. We discuss some of the smaller titles we individually checked out in the first half of the podcast, and in the back half, we discuss and review the game or games of the month that we both played. This time, we are talking about Harvest Moon, the very
If
first
you
title of the
if you
Story
didn't
of
figure
Seasons
that out.
franchise for the Super Nintendo, and also Harvest Moon 64, uh, the third-ish title in the franchise for the Nintendo 64. Um, Before we get to that, though, Chris, what have you been playing?
I have also been playing Claymates, which is for Super Nintendo, and Killer Instinct, also for Super Nintendo.
Did you say Playmates?
Claymates. I know,
Oh,
a
Claymates.
play on Playmates, but Claymates. Yeah.
Playmates. Was that the fighting series? No.
Okay. So if you, well, I mean, I can start on my reviews playing them if you want, because that's a
Yeah,
bit of
let's
a.
talk about Claymates.
So I looked at that, and exactly what you're talking about was in my mind when I was looking at the icon at it, and I'm like, oh great, there's Killer Instinct. I'll do two fighter games.
Hmm.
Claymates is not the fighter game. That was, and I figured it out after a while. That was Clay Fighter,
Right, which
which
is
I did
also
not
on the
see.
online library, I believe.
I don't think it is actually. Is it? I didn't find it.
I'll do some research while you tell me
Okay.
about
If it is,
Claymates.
that's great. Then I'll do that next time because we did play it when we were young, and I have fond memories. Um, so Claymates is a clayish game. Um I don't know if it used the same technology as Clay Fighter because I think Clay Fighter actually used real clay stop motion for the moves and recorded them, and then like digitized them somehow. So that was, I don't know if Claymates did it. I mean, there's a bit of a clay look to it that is for sure. You know, like you can tell it's supposed to be clay characters and
Hmm.
stuff. But it's not as distinct as actual clay figures in Clay Fighter, which probably for anyone listening and has no idea what either of them are, this is not giving much detail. But think like
Yeah.
Clay.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
sorry to sidetrack us. The clay-based game that I was thinking of that's on the Nintendo Switch library is Stunt Racer FX, the clay
Oh
racing game,
yes, which is also good.
which we used to play.
I thought about
Clay
playing.
Fighters, yeah, I guess was a whole thing back in the day. Kind
Yeah.
of in the era, well, post Gumby, I guess,
Hmm.
when claymation was a thing that doesn't really exist
Yeah.
anymore.
Sadly,
But
no.
yeah, so how did Claymates end up being? I assume this is your first time playing.
Yeah, and then like seeing it, I'm like, I kind of remember reading about it in Nintendo Power, but I didn't think much of it. Um, it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. It
Gotcha.
The controls were not bad, but they were lacking in some ways, and especially it's one of the games that like you can figure out what to do, but there's not much tutorial as to what's actually happening. So there's a lot of
Hmm.
like weird things to grab or to do, and I don't understand what they all were, kind of thing. It just was very odd. Like there's a story, and it's like your uncle gets kidnapped, but he's clay, and so you're like a person, but you start off each level as a ball of clay, which is really weird. And so from the ball of clay you grab like a power up thing and you transform into an animal that has special abilities, but it was confusing as to when you would transform into which animal and what they could really do and all this other stuff. It wasn't too helpful in that way. You fight other clay animals that I guess are bad. I don't know why. They're bad.
This is a platformer, right?
This is a platformer, yeah. So so that's happening in between. It's not really stage select menu. You are going through this like neighborhood as well. At first, I didn't play too long in it just because I was not entertained um,
Hmm.
by a lot of it, and so I was going through some of the stage things, and it's like there's these robots that were getting objects out of the way for you to progress, but you had to move other objects in order for them to go. And this is in the stage select screen. So you had to figure out how to make the robots go to their part. And then you would go to a level and play the platformer part. So the stage select part really looked like a stage, like the old Mario kind of over the top views where um, you're just sort of going in a grid type thing. So it was a little weird in that way. Just, and I think a lot of it was just the huge lack of tutorial for it for me. So
Yeah, just watching a little gameplay from this, it seems wildly strange.
yeah,
Um, so how would you rate your experience with Claymates?
um, I don't know why I didn't think about this because I didn't like it, but it's a very
Hmm.
traditional platformer, and it wasn't like horrible. Like it's something to kind of pick up and do. Like almost like if it were an iPhone game, it's fine because you could just do it every once in a while. It's just something to pass the time. So I kind of want to give it one thumb up for that reason. It
Hmm.
wasn't. It wasn't great. It just was a bit of a lackluster platformer. So,
Gotcha.
but I'd give it one thumb up for that way. Like the controls weren't so bad that it wasn't playable. It was definitely playable. So
Hmm.
that's the good thing about it. And there's some fun things of trying to change into the animals, stuff like that. But other than that, not much story, not big with the graphics. It just was lackluster. So
Yeah, it sounds really confusing. I've been having a little bit of video playing in the background just to try to get a feel for this game since I knew nothing about it. And it's still very confusing on what in the world is going on.
oh yeah,
But
and
you know what?
the game doesn't
That's
actually
kind of
help.
a fun thing to experiment
Yeah.
and see what else was out there that we did not play growing up.
Hmm.
Um, from a tepid recommendation, let me introduce one of my games. I'm going to go ahead and say that this gets a hearty must play recommendation, two thumbs way up for
Wow.
WarioWare Inc. for the Game Boy
Oh.
Advance.
Okay.
Um, it is it is a game that takes the concept of mini games and shortens them down even further into micro games that only last for a few seconds. Have you played any of the WarioWare games, Chris?
Oh, I have. I have. Do I only have one for Wii? I feel like I got it maybe for Wii, and I don't know if I but for Wii U. You currently
Gotcha.
have my Wii U, so if I gave you the WarioWare game for Wii U,
I'll go look to
then.
see if you have one.
But I know I had one
Um,
for Wii, which was just so fun. I would play that
mhm.
so many just random nights. Yeah.
So you've got because this is another kind of strange game to explain. But these micro games will be kind of thrown at you incredibly quickly. It'll say just like a one line, sometimes a
Yep.
one word explanation. Something like catch will pop up on screen, and you'll see a stick falling through the air, and you have to time a hand that's on screen just right so it catches the stick out of the air. Or it'll say squash, and then all of a sudden you're playing the original Mario Brothers, and there's a Goomba in front of you that you need to jump on. Um, it's wildly fun, very strange, and
Yeah.
um, a strange sense of humor. But I can never get enough of this. I think I've played this one and the DS version, and I think there was like another Game Boy Advance title with movement controls. All of
Yeah.
them I adored to death. played them completely. I even just in the little time I played with it completed WarioWare a second time on the Switch now. Um, Very fun. It's something that needs to be experienced to fully understand, but I would think that most people would have a good time, um, even if it's just a short time. Um, the trial and error nature of these micro games is just so fun, and it seems like something that could be frustrating, where you're just tossed into a game, you don't know what it's going to be, there's not really any instructions, and you just have to figure it out. That could be frustrating because you might lose, but something about the very fast nature and the fact that you can make four mistakes before you actually get a game over gave it fought the frustration just enough to make it challenging and not frustrating.
Well, but
Um,
that's even some of the point of the WarioWare games, right? Like it's about the trial, like specifically, it's about the trial and error that you're doing all
mhm.
these to, yeah, um,
I,
to
I've
possibly
heard somewhat
lose, but yeah.
I've heard somewhat mixed reviews on the
Hmm.
two latest WarioWare titles. Some enjoyment
Oh,
still, but not quite as consistent as the early games. But I would
mm,
definitely recommend all the early games uh, as something worth checking out for people that enjoy classic games. You also mentioned Killer Instinct as a game you
hmm.
checked out, a traditional fighting game. How was your experience with that?
So as I was playing it, I could not remember. I think we did rent it, maybe just once. Um, Kids who are listening to this podcast, you could rent video games from a store called Blockbuster, in which you would go and grab them and then play them for about 5 days before returning them back to a Blockbuster store. That's how we played games. But yeah, I think that we maybe rented it just once
Hmm.
or something like that. But they're also, I mean, I don't know if you remember, Killer Instinct when it came out was a huge deal because this was Nintendo's actual first fighting game, first and maybe only fighting game franchise. I don't think, well, Smash, I guess technically,
So
but
this is actually made by Nintendo, not just
I believe
played
it
on
was.
Nintendo.
Yeah, it was done by Rare as well. The same people who did like Donkey Kong Country, that whole thing, but they made it to be a fighting game for the Super Nintendo with a lot of those graphics, and then at the same time, or like not, like maybe a couple months after having it for Super Nintendo, they made it as an arcade game, which is a huge deal. That I don't know if you remember. Like you could, and I want to say that there was some way that you could like coordinate between the Super Nintendo game and that one, but I might be rather wrong with that. So don't quote me on that. But I remember, I remember the Killer Instinct, arcade um, boxes in tons of arcades that we would go to. That was a huge deal. So I remember the phenomenon. Apparently, I didn't remember playing a lot of it. Um,
Hmm.
and it was a nice fighting game. My fighting games are generally have been by Capcom. So Street Fighter, Marvel superheroes versus
Hmm.
Capcom, stuff like that. And so I'm very much used to that fighting style, and so I approach almost every fighting game that way. If it's going to be that kind of thing, I mean, even Mortal Kombat, I approach in style of Capcom games, which probably is not the best approach for them. But going into it, that's what I was trying. There are some moves with Killer Instinct that were the same, like the same button presses to do some things like fire something or do an uppercut, that kind of thing. Um, so it was fun, um, and it was a little challenging too. It could because it was not quite Street Fighter, And so that was rather interesting to me to have that challenge with it. The one interesting, um, possibly unique or unique for the time about the fighting style is you would have rounds, but um, health bars would continue through the rounds. So they wouldn't reset. It was like you were fighting your opponent and getting them. I think the bar was changing color, so there was like a difference in the color at first. So if you got them all the way filled with that new color, then you won that round, and then it would go on to the next round, and then it was a matter of like depleting your opponent, their health bar, but your health bar was slowly ticking up too in that new color in that next round. So the rounds could be 3 rounds really easily each time I played. But it was possible to do it just in 2 rounds. I think I did that a couple times. So it was actually kind of a nice feature, I think, to have it that
Hmm,
way. Yeah.
that is interesting.
Hmm.
And is this in the Mortal Kombat kind of over the top cartoony violence or semi realistic violence? Or is
I
this more like a Street Fighter where, there's violence involved in fighting, but it isn't trying to cover the screen in blood or anything?
yeah, I would maybe say in between, but a little bit closer to Street Fighter because they were more cartoony type characters. But I think they were going for some realistic graphics. So there is some blood. I think it had a mature rating back in the day, but it really wasn't. It wasn't like Mortal Kombat mature.
Hmm.
Not by any means. There was some blood. There was, some realistic effects to it, but it wasn't. It was still cartoony. So yeah.
And were you able to make any sense of any story in the game? Because fighting games have some wild stories sometimes.
No, I mean, other than the very traditional, somehow you've got these characters that are coming together to see who's the winner. Like, that's the most that I figured out. But I know it had a deep story to it. I think Nintendo tried to make a deep story with it. I don't
Hmm.
remember what it was at all. If there really was one or not. Yeah.
Probably in the little booklet that came with the game or something.
Hmm.
Um, I did see that it was indeed developed by Rare, published by Nintendo.
Okay, there we go.
So I don't think Nintendo was involved in the development of this game, because
No.
eventually the franchise was rebooted on Xbox some many
Hmm.
years later.
Yeah, because
Still sounds
Donkey
fun.
Kong Country was done by Rare, right?
Yes,
Or they
pretty
helped
sure.
develop. I think that's probably the only one that was really also done with Nintendo. There's probably a couple other type games that did it, but yeah, I know Rare did a few others that were on their own at some point. So this was, yeah, I guess that was. This is a confusing one of like Nintendo really pushed it and was trying to say this is our fighting game, but you're right, they didn't really develop it. It was Rare that did. So yeah,
Gotcha. Because I think we just played Street Fighter on Super Nintendo.
mostly yeah.
So,
So
a thumb up, two thumbs up. How would you rate
I
Killer Instinct?
for a virtual console retro video game, I would give it 2 thumbs up. It's worth checking
Oh
out
wow,
and playing. I mean,
nice.
it like I said, it's got that unique way of doing the rounds. So, but to me, fighting games are a lot of time are kind of like a pickup game. You can go to it any time, have some fun, do some brawls, move on, that kind of thing. So
Hmm.
it's definitely worth checking out in that way. Yeah.
Nice. Well, now it is time for yet another installment of Two Brothers Golf a Game, as I played Mario Golf for the Game Boy
Oh.
Color. Of note,
Oh.
there is a Game Boy Advance library and a Game Boy library. The Game Boy Color games fall into the Game Boy library. And this was probably one of my favorite games growing up. I played the entire thing on a Game Boy Color way back in the day and had the best time. I was obsessed with this game. Um, Strangely enough, I was looking up information about Mario Golf, and I kept getting information for the N64 title Mario Golf. And not only was it
Mm-hmm.
named the exact same thing, it
Yeah.
came out the same year. Both games came out in 1999. Both were called Mario Golf, one for the Game Boy Color and one for the N64, except they were very different games. It's not like we made a Game Boy tie-in to a bigger N64 game. They made one that featured the Mario characters a bit more prominently in the N64, and one that was more of an RPG, golf RPG, for the Game Boy. And that's just quite the choice to release two games and probably confuse a lot of parents around the holidays
Mm-hmm.
when their kid got the wrong golf. But that's okay. This was the golf RPG, and we have played quite a few of those in our podcast's illustrious history. And this is the one that held like such a special place in my memory, but it didn't quite hit the same playing it now on
Oh.
the Switch. It is 25 years old. It was made for a very old and limited system. You know, the Game Boy
Mm-hmm.
Color wasn't that much more powerful than the original Game Boy, and it looks surprisingly dated. It is
Mm.
the kind of the same graphical styling as the very first Pokemon game, Red and Blue, and it it's just a bit drab, unfortunately.
Mm.
The gameplay was still solid. The golfing itself, lots of courses, varied, different systems. One of the things that was unique to this game and has been copied many times since is not only could you go play a round of golf and try to get the best score in a tournament, but you could go one-on-one versus a club champ, and that would be
Mm.
you would get a point if you won a hole. It didn't matter how much you won or lost by. It just mattered whether you won the hole. So it was the first to win like 9 holes would clinch that kind of match, which was interesting. And there were also these tiny little challenges. You'd go to a putting green, and somebody there would be like, "Hey, I bet you can't make this putt, this very strange, unique putt." That was something that we talked about in was it Golf Story? Now I'm trying to remember what that golf game we played in the past. Yeah,
Yeah.
Golf Story,
Yeah. Ghost
the
Story.
very first game we talked about.
Yeah.
Um, it 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 allowed you to both learn the game and how to get out of these strange golfing situations, while also they would award experience points, and after enough experience points from golfing around or doing these little challenges, you would level up, and you could both improve in the game by just getting better at it, but also by putting points into your drive or your control or other sorts of
Hmm.
um, stats
Oh,
that would
so
help
level
you
up. Yeah.
perform better. Yeah. So that was pretty novel for its time and still very
Yeah.
fun. One little quirk that I remembered having an issue with back in the Game Boy Color days was when you hit the golf ball, you had the three press um, timing system that is very common in golf games still, and it's pretty hard to actually lock in that perfect shot. So what ended up being better off is because if you didn't hit a perfect shot, you would often fall, 10 yards or something less distance. It was better to overshoot your ball, planning on not getting a perfect shot, and then it would fall much closer to the hole or much closer where you wanted.
Oh.
Except you could very often accidentally hit a perfect shot, which puts you in quite the position of I did it too good and the ball went too far because I was planning on not doing it so good. So that was just a fun little strange quirk of this game is that sometimes it's better to be more consistently bad than actually good. Um, So I do hold this game in very high esteem. I think it is worth checking out, but unfortunately it has aged a lot. So I decided to only go with one thumb up, even though back in
Oh,
the day I would have easily given this two thumbs up. I have a third title. Did you have one you wanted to
oh,
talk about?
I did not have a third title. No.
All right. I think this one will interest you.
Okay.
Based on our shared video gaming history, I played Extreme G for the N64, which is one of their newer titles on the online library. Obviously, game that came out in '97, not exactly a new game. But this is a futuristic racing game where you're racing fancy futuristic motorcycles, very much in the F-Zero or Wipeout
Yeah. Okay.
games style. Even to some degree, it's much like a much faster, more futuristic looking kart racer, because not only do you have racing at high speeds, but you also have power ups and weapons scattered across the course that you pick up to battle against the other racers and try to get an edge. It was very fun. It was surprisingly fast, and even though it
Hmm.
is an old title, I think the visuals still held up pretty good for expressing cool environments to race through, and the courses were, very dynamic with that futuristic racer over the topness of massive loops and hills and inclines that are truly interesting. Even round portions of the course where you can race around the walls and ceiling, trying to get the edge up or just do something cool. I really had fun with this game. I think if you enjoy like an F-Zero or a Wipeout PlayStation franchise, then this could be a very fun afternoon for you playing this old game.
Hmm.
I'm definitely giving it one thumb up.
Oh,
Probably
not two.
not
After all that.
probably not two, because I ended up like I had fun with it for about 40 minutes and then moved on.
Okay.
Um, so it didn't quite have the staying power for a two thumbs up for me, but I think it could be a two thumbs up game for anyone that's a big fan of this futuristic racing genre.
Okay.
It does seem to have the depth to keep going.
Hmm.
So then, shall we move on to Harvest Moon?
Sure. Let's go.
Sounds good. So we can describe both Harvest. We'll tackle the original Harvest Moon first, but you could describe both games the exact same way, which is will speed us up a little bit. Um, both games are about a young man whose grandfather lived in the country on a farm. As your grandfather aged, the farm fell into disrepair, and at the time of the game's start, your grandfather has just passed away, and you are entrusted with bringing the farm back to life by cleaning up the land, planting crops, and acquiring and raising livestock. In addition, and another very large portion of the game is not just farming, but there is some sort of small town nearby with tons of people that you can help out, befriend, and kind of form a community with by participating in town festivals and things like that. You can get married and have children and explore the countryside in this game in between all of your farm chores. And you play for usually like 2 to 3 years, depending on the game, with a year typically being 30 days, or excuse me, a season typically being 30 days, so a year being 120 in-game days. At the end of that time period, your father visits from the big city and evaluates how you've done in the farm, and I believe I did not make it to the end of either of these games. These are very big games.
Yeah.
Um, I believe your father is typically pretty harsh unless you played a very perfect game. Um, I know because I've played the entirety of Stardew Valley a few times, and originally the evaluation was pretty hard to please and was a bit harsh. So in a later update for Stardew Valley, they toned him down a little bit, and I would assume, as I know Harvest Moon was one of the biggest inspirations for Stardew Valley, that uh, I would expect a pretty harsh review from your big city father who doesn't understand life on the farm. So do your best because you're probably going to disappoint your father. How do you like the aesthetic of the Harvest Moon on the NS on the Super Nintendo?
So I think the graphics were nice, but maybe um, a little too simple in some ways. I kind of
Hmm.
wondered. It As weird as that is, it just I don't know. There's something about it that like some things weren't detailed enough to me,
Hmm.
and that kind of bothered me. And I mean, these are two games. It's kind of funny. I think I can say neither one of us played when we were kids.
I
Um,
definitely have not did not play either of these games before. You as well?
Me as well. I did not. Yeah. So I always heard about them. I always saw them talked about in magazines or reviewed in some way, and but just didn't. Yeah, we just never played them in any way. So I think my expectations were kind of high, and so that included a lot of the graphics. Thinking for some reason, these are going to be phenomenal. And I, we were coming off of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which
Hmm.
makes great use of the amount of colors that you can use and the actual graphics for the Super Nintendo. And so I kind of was hoping for the same. I think for this, and I was a little disappointed with how it looked and how things were set up aesthetically. Even it wasn't. I say that that's those are my complaints, but it wasn't terrible. There was a lot of things that I did like. I liked the actually I liked the way the people looked. It was a very traditional like JRPG kind of look from Super Nintendo, and that's fun and nice. It's simple enough and a simple game that you probably don't need a lot of graphics, but um, yeah. So those are my thoughts. A lot
That's fair.
on that. Yeah.
As you were saying that, I was kind of curious because I think it is pretty clear that A Link to the Past is a better looking game. And in fact, I thought, well, maybe it's a more, it came out later, so there's more
No.
improvements that have been made to how the Super Nintendo developers like learned how to code. But in fact, um, Harvest Moon SNES came out in '96, while Link to the Past came out in '91.
Yeah.
So 5 years before, they were doing much more with the SNES system. Unfortunate. I would agree that it is a little dated and kind of like what you were saying. Sometimes it was hard to tell what stage a crop had grown to.
Hmm.
It'd be seeds and then a sprout and then a little bit bigger and then it would be harvestable. And it wasn't always 100% clear when it moved to that harvestable state, which was unfortunate. But I found the art style to be incredibly charming. There's definitely a cutesy nature to these games that I actually was looking at more recent titles in the Story of Seasons and Harvest Moon genre, and then the new Harvest Moon franchise has started to move into a more realistic vibe from
Ah.
the roots of this kind of cutesy, chibi style characters that I believe are largely still carried forward in the Story of Seasons games. I found it very pleasant. Like it gave me that warm and friendly atmosphere. The music was relaxing and bouncy, kind of suited to the themes of the game, and I felt it aged very well. Even though I think you're 100% right that they probably didn't use the SNES to its best level. How about I have a lot to say about this, but I'm curious what you thought about the Harvest Moon gameplay.
I had some trouble with the Super Nintendo one. I mean, we're starting with that and to
Mhm.
describe. Um, I know they explained some things at the beginning,
Mhm.
but I still was at a loss for some things to do. Like I didn't still quite understand what to do with some of the controls and gameplay. It took me a long time at the beginning to figure out that I still needed to talk to someone in the town in order to keep moving, which was a big
Oh,
pain at
that
first.
I got stuck there for a little bit too.
And that, yeah, so that really did not set things up to be great for me. Um, so that was kind of a disappointment in some ways to start off that way and just be like, why is this not more explanatory? Like what I need to do. Um, it there's not a lot to figure out, which is good for like a lack of some tutorial part. And I know that's some of the element of the game because you're trying to figure out how to plant, so they don't want to tell you exactly what to do. You kind of have to figure it out so that um, what's going to be the best crop at what times. Like I totally understand that, but I even think some of the simplicity, because it just was like something of it was hard to tell if I was actually getting rid of the bigger item type things on the farm, like the bigger rocks and stuff. Like it
Oh yeah,
it's like, oh, do I keep going? Do I keep hammering? Do I stop?
right.
Do I have to pick it up? Do I have to use a different tool? Like some of that was a little bit weird to figure out because there's just no indication of it. Um, so I feel like simple controls, which is great, but it still needed a little bit more explanation of how to do things. So yeah.
I found it really intriguing. I think there is like a learn to play or something like that button on the start screen before you actually launch into the game. But if I'm remembering correctly, it's been a while since I tried this. When you press it, it just shows you video of somebody playing the game. So there's
Yes.
no like explanation of what to do. It's just like, oh, okay, he's taking care of the farm. He's hoeing the soil. Okay,
Hmm.
now he's planting seeds. Okay, it plants like that. And then he needs to water it, of course, and then he needs to go and take care of the animals and stuff like that. So it's a very interesting take on the tutorial, but it actually inspired me because I like the explanations more, the tutorials. So what I did for both of these games and might carry forward in the future is I would watch a let's play on YouTube of somebody playing and talking over the game because they tend to explain things as they're going as well as you can just see how the game
Right.
goes. And
Yeah.
so I'd watch like 15 minutes of that, and then I'd start up my own game once I had an idea, and I would play while the video was playing in the background. So that served as a interesting tutorial as I went. That was inspired by a very old, strange decision at a tutorial in this game.
Yeah.
Um, I want to go back for just a second, kind of explain what a Harvest Moon game and a farming sim is, this type of farming sim is for anyone that hasn't played the genre before. Um, Most of what these games involve is doing either farm or town chores each day over and over again. You've got to water and plant, you've got to pet your animals and put out feed for them, you've got to find and collect items and then bring them into town as gifts for your friends. Like, you're going to be doing these things over and over and over again, and that is part of it. That's a feature of the genre. So,
Yeah.
like, if that's not appealing to you, like the idea of doing chores in a video game, I totally get it. But that's what this genre is, and most people really love it because it's very relaxing and comforting to have that routine. And you get to build up your farm slowly, and you get to make your friends happy and things like that. Um, did you enjoy it? Did you find it relaxing? Do you normally find it relaxing playing these kind of chore-like games?
I can find it relaxing. I mean, what comes to mind immediately was the amount of time that I've played Animal Crossing games, and I do enjoy those. I wouldn't say I enjoy them all the time. They're not the games that I go to first if I just want a game to relax with. But I don't mind them. I know I played a little bit of Stardew Valley. I played other games that are um, like harvesting in some way, doing stuff. I again, I think it was a lack of explanation for me that I wasn't too motivated um, to do a lot with it, or like the mundaneness, because I didn't really feel like there was a huge aim for me. It it just didn't help. I think for this one.
I think you made a ton of great points at like rough points in this game. Like you were saying, how many times do I have to hit this rock, or can I not hit it? Can I not break it?
Yeah.
Because it only took 6 hits to break a rock or a stump with your starter mallet and your starter axe. However, if you moved or if you were interrupted by like the "I'm tired" animation, then it would reset. So it could easily
Oh,
take you 11 hits because
I
after
didn't
the
even know
fifth
that.
hit, you would wipe your brow off to represent that your stamina's getting low, and then you go
Yeah.
back and you're like, okay, I'm back to start apparently. So this game is felt like a very much a rough draft of the more
Hmm.
robust games that would follow over the nearly 30 years of farming sims since this game came out.
Hmm.
There are a ton of quirks, and it's not entirely fair to compare it to a game like Stardew Valley that had 20 years of innovations to
Yeah.
consider and work into the game. Um, while this was avant-garde for the age, probably.
Oh,
um,
and it really was. Like I again, like I remember reading about it in a lot of magazines. I mean, not just like Nintendo Power, but I think what was it? Game Pro. Game Pro.
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, things like that. I don't know. I like they just were innovative, like you're saying, and it was such a different game that I think it was a hit for the time. I mean, absolutely. Yeah.
Some more of the rough edges I wanted to talk about, especially when comparing it to modern games, is of note, there is no inventory in Harvest Moon 1. There thankfully was in 64, which we'll get to. But you had the option to hold two tools, and to change your tools, you'd go to a tool shed, which kind of makes sense. That's probably somewhat realistic.
Hmm.
Um, you would go and swap your tools around. So you had a switch tools button between the two you had, and a use tool button, which was pretty confusing. And also, seeds were considered tools. So when you bought them, you'd have to go to the tool shed
Yeah.
to grab your seeds before you could sow your fields. Um, that was very tricky because in these games where you have to plant like fields of crops, that means that you have to individually pick up each crop, take it to the shipping bin, and toss it in there to make
Yep.
your money over and over again. So it made it very important to just plant near the shipping bin. Otherwise, you'd run out of time very quickly. In fact, another difference between modern games is both the SNES and the 64 Harvest Moon titles. A day would only be about 3-ish minutes in real time. So that was not a lot of time to take care of your farm chores, take care of your animals, go into town and talk to your friends, grab a gift off the
Hmm.
mountain and bring it all the way back to town because you can't store it, so that you could give it as a gift. Stop by the fishing hole and do a little fishing. That there's way too many options. Not in a bad way. There's so many things you could do, and only a limited time to do it in, which is kind of realistic. There's probably 1,000 things I'd love to do in my day, and I have to choose the 5 or 6 things that I can do in a day. So it's interesting because and even when I was watching the Let's Plays, it's so much of, oh, I want to go do this, that, and the next thing. Oh, but I need to do that. Oh, and the festival's coming up, so you're
Hmm.
constantly trying to reevaluate what you're going to do with your day and your time, um, which is interesting. It is a very you have to focus on your goals, and that's almost a useful life skill to be building a video game. Um, One of the things that was, again, a very strange quirk this time just of the SNES title is, again, your day goes really fast. You get 3-ish minutes to go from 6 a.m. in the morning to about 5, 6 p.m. at night when things shut down. Except then time stops. So I don't know if you noticed this, but there's no end to night in the Super Nintendo game.
I
There's no
didn't, but
time.
yeah, it.
Yeah, there's
I mean, it didn't seem to like matter if I was still doing a few things at night. Also, so
in modern games like Stardew Valley, if you stay out too late, you will collapse of exhaustion, and somebody will drag you back to your bed in the morning, and you will have consequences for not making it back to bed. I
mhm.
think that's the case with the 64 title, but I didn't actually make it to the point of exhaustion in that game. But in the SNES title, it created this strange dichotomy of during the day you do all the things that are time limited, like go and give a gift to your friend, and then at night you can go do all the farm work you want because there's unlimited time. You're kind of limited by how much stamina you have, but even that, there are many exploits to work around to get back your stamina, so you can
Mhm.
farm for hours and hours at night, real world hours and hours if you wanted to. Though, generally speaking, you're still going to move forward fairly quickly just because you need time to pass for crops to grow and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, let's see. There are a couple other quirks in that you don't have an on screen clock, you don't know what time it is in this Super Nintendo title, and you don't know how much stamina you have. But I pretty quickly found uh, how the game was trying to express that. If you didn't notice, it's like he stops and has a lunch break at noon and at five
Mhm.
o'clock,
Oh,
where he pulls out a rice ball and eats it, and so like that's your indicator of what time it is. And
okay,
I think eventually you can buy a clock in the game, which
okay.
feels like something that could have been in there from the start. And then when you're working in the on the farm, you will eventually kind of wipe your brow of sweat, and that indicates you're down to like half stamina. And then you might fall over, and that indicates you're down to just a quarter stamina. Um, and those things ended up working out just fine. Like I was pretty put off by it at first, but it was fine. Um, let's go on to the story, unless you have any other gameplay thoughts.
No, I think you hit some good ones. Yeah.
What did you think of the story? Did you engage much with the villagers?
Not too much because, like you said, it was hard to like get everything done in a day. So, um, I tried in some ways, but also I felt like engaging with them there wasn't a heck of a lot to it either. I mean, depending on the villager, so there wasn't a lot that I would do or want to do with them. I mostly stuck to the farm. I That might be very different for you.
I did try to get like the full experience of experiencing what story there was. There's not a ton in Harvest Moon. Um, the villagers are most of the story of the village itself, and but the dialogue is pretty limited. I think any character only has like 10 lines of dialogue or so that they'll say around town. I think they have a little extra for the festivals, perhaps. And then the characters were pretty uh, one-dimensional. There was the girl that hangs out at church and asks you, "Do you believe in God?" And if you say
Hmm.
yes, she's happy. If you say no, she's not. She's less happy, but not upset with you.
Yeah.
And it's just like, okay, so that's your thing, and that's all there is to you. And then you go to the flower shop, and there's a gal there who asks you, "Do you like flowers?" And if you say yes, she likes you a little bit more than if you say no. And that's her whole thing is flowers. So there's not a ton there. I didn't make it to the first festival because it's pretty late in the spring for this game, but I did watch a Let's Play of it, and it's cute. You know, they redecorate the town square, that kind of brick-looking area in the center of town, and
Hmm.
there's booths, and you can buy like a gift for your friend that you want to potentially romance and marry. You can talk to everyone, and they have a special line of dialogue, and it's a cute little thing. You could choose somebody to dance with, and that's the day. So it's a nice change of pace from the kind of mundane chores to have these festivals and other things like that. But I think Harvest Moon, the first game, was pretty story light and in a little bit of a disappointing way. So how about final thoughts on Harvest Moon, and how would you rate it?
Whew. And I've had a feeling all while playing, like even before this, I have a feeling I'm gonna grade it harsher, kind of like the father in Harvest Moon, or harsher than you
Oh, Big
might
City
grade
Chris
it.
is here to ruin our fun.
uh, this one, I still would give one thumb,
Uh-huh.
and it wasn't a bad game, and I think it does appeal to people. But I think its quirks, for me, said, like you really have to be okay with the quirks, and it may be appealing to still play it. It may not be, but yeah, it like you said, it's story light. It's a little bit of gameplay light because it's the same thing over and over. So I think just one thumb up for me for it.
Gotcha. In my final thoughts for this game, it's just talking about Harvest Moon. It is such an important title to video games that would come after it. It's such a foundational title that so many hundreds of games have built upon that it feels incredibly important for that reason alone. Like without Harvest Moon, I don't think we get Stardew Valley. Without Stardew Valley having its
Hmm.
huge popularity boost, I wonder if the cozy genre is nearly as robust as it is today. Like, is it cut in half? Is it cut in a quarter? Um, I think it would be a very different world, and so much is owed to Harvest Moon for that
Hmm.
reason. And that makes it very notable as like a piece of history that is worth experiencing, partially just for its historic value. I did give it one thumb up because it is very rough around the edge. It feels very first drafty.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm also going to give it a another point for being worth playing for anyone because I think it ages reasonably well and is still fun and is because of its historic value. Do you agree this is a game worth playing for anyone with the online pass?
Ooh. I would. I would maybe say no.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
very fair. I do think something that I was coming back to for both of these games is would I recommend going back to play these when you could just play a modern farming sim that is a much better game?
Mm.
Whether it's Story of Seasons or Stardew Valley or one of the myriad of life sim, farming sim games that have come out of every flavor and variety. Uh, there's so many better options in many ways. So let's say the half point for that, since I gave it the point and you gave it the no point. Now, here's an interesting one because the last rating was going to be for nostalgia factor, but neither of us have played this game.
Yeah.
So we can theorize, or we can just kind of give it the half point of we can't really say yes or no. Uh, uh, I personally think that this game will scratch the nostalgia itch for people that played this game in the past. I think that's the case for both of these games, but I can't say for a fact because I didn't play in the past. What do
Yeah.
you
I'd say
think?
half point. Go for it.
Half point? Okay,
Yeah.
let's call it a half point for games that we are not nostalgic for, but could be for you. So that gets it a 3 out of 6. Not bad for the very first Harvest Moon, the originator of so many games today. And we still need to talk about Harvest Moon 64.
We do.
Um, what do you think about the presentation of Harvest Moon 64?
So, improved graphics, of course, because of the system that it was on. I do think that it was a little bit easier to see certain things and figure out where things were at. The map at first was very weird, like
Mm-hmm.
the way it appeared and where to find different things. Um, that I thought was kind of strange and not as great as the first one, oddly. But overall, I think a good upgrade from the Super Nintendo one. It was that interesting. Is the 3/4 view? I'm trying to think of how to
I
describe the
believe,
view.
yeah, or it's a classic 3D game at the kind of on the diagonal.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you see that you can rotate the camera? Because that took me a while to realize.
No, I didn't
At
know.
least on the farm. I don't know if you can do it in other places, but it did help a lot with the farming because trying to do it on the diagonals was a little hard.
Oh my gosh, are you serious? Yeah, because
Yeah.
if talking about gameplay, that was going to be a big thing for me. Was the gameplay was improved in some ways, except for that. Like there's so many times, and I lost a plant once trying to put it in the bin because it was not aimed right.
Lost so many plants playing both of these games.
Oh my gosh!
I even
Which thank
accidentally hit
goodness for
my horse with
the
a
virtual
tool.
console. Oh, sorry, what?
I even once hit my horse with a tool by accident. He did not like that.
I'm sure you didn't. Um, I do like. I will say what I utilize in a lot of the virtual console games that we've been playing is the rewind feature that they
Uh-huh.
have. So when I lost a plant, I'm like, oh, I'll just rewind it and get like aim better, and it worked. So
That's a good
yeah,
point. I know you can rewind on the Super Nintendo. Were you able to in Harvest Moon 64? I didn't
I
think you
believe I
could in
did because I think
64.
that's how I did. Nah, I want to say, or maybe not. Maybe I because I had done a certain like you can do the save points too that are different
Uh-huh.
than saves in the game. So I
Yeah.
think I might have actually gone back to a save point and just
Oh,
I wasn't like that far back in the save point, so it
right.
wasn't
This
that
was
big of a deal.
probably
Like
earlier
maybe a
today or
day,
something.
yeah. So you're right. I might have actually done that because this was a little bit of a different rewind system than some of the other games for the N64 Virtual Console.
I
So
don't think the N64 has the rewind function. The SNES, all the
perhaps not.
SNES games can. So you definitely could have in the first Harvest Moon title, but I don't think that's an option for the 64, though the save states are very nice to be able to save at any time and come
Hmm.
back.
I think the
Um,
Genesis. I think Genesis also has that as well. The
yes, I
rewind.
believe so. The rewind
Um,
feature on the Genesis, probably the Game Boy, kind of the oldest titles have that, but I'm
yeah,
not sure if like
you
advanced
might be right.
and
And I'm
uh,
yeah,
N64 do.
yeah.
Um, it was certainly a visual improvement, Harvest Moon 64 over the SNES. For a little context, Harvest Moon 64 came out 3 years, only 3 years after the SNES title, and there was one
Wow.
Game Boy title in between
Okay.
the SNES and these N64. Um, I the 3D sprites and whatnot, the kind of chibi 3D sprites, are a very unique aesthetic that was, common to many games around the PlayStation 1 and N64 era. But I actually found that the N64 title had aged more, in my opinion, than the SNES title had, because the textures were kind of blurry. Probably
Hmm.
limitations of the hardware, very
Yeah.
reasonable things. But I didn't care for that. And while you did have these very impressive 3D structures in town, you probably noticed around the edge of the screen, there's just constant pop-in happening as
Hmm.
the game removes textures to try to save memory and then pops them back in when you move into frame. Um, I'm sure it kept the game running very smoothly, but it was
I
distracting to me.
I lost my horse a couple times because of it.
Oh, that's tragedy. Um, the music was pleasant to listen to, but every time you moved a screen, like you moved from your farm to the in between space between all of the other locations, up to the mountain, up to the upper mountain, up to the western mountain, the soundtrack would restart over and over and
Uh
over
huh.
again, and I did not care for that. So many of the gripes I have for both this and the SNES title probably can be attributed to simple limitations of game design at the time, technology of the
Yeah,
time. So like, it's not really a flaw or a failure; it's just a limitation. Um, but it also kind of wasn't. It took away from the experience a little bit. How about gameplay? How do you like the how the gameplay had changed to the 64 era?
I did think it was an improvement, and I did like it more. I don't know if it was also because I was used to the Super Nintendo stuff first, but I
Mhm.
do think that overall I like the backpack feature, you know, like where you can switch all the tools and stuff that way. I like that it was a little bit. There was a lot more to it with the menus. Like there was, you know, the TV would give information. The calendar or the diary had a little bit more on the menu. I do think that there was good improvement with it, but I wouldn't say it was, you know, vastly improved. I wouldn't say that it was like perfected in any way. It just improved in general
Mhm.
to me. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a pretty big jump again for only 3 years of development from the original, and the menu being the most helpful change. You
Hmm.
could now move from carrying not two tools up to nine tools, eight slots, and one equipped. And you could also hold eight items in your inventory, which isn't a lot, but it's enough to help you keep a couple flowers so that you don't need to take them immediately into town as gifts, or you
Yeah.
could carry some items from the mountain and sell them in your shipping box to make some money early game before you have many crops growing. And so it made a big difference. The navigating the menu was a bit slow and chunky,
Yeah.
but it it was still an improvement. I think you said earlier that visually it was a little more clear what was happening on the screen, like plant growth and things like that. I 100% agree. I think they did a great job making that clearer what is happening on screen. Though, again, I thought the textures were a bit blurry in an unattractive
Hmm.
way. Um,
Especially compared to some other, you know, like not that all N64 games look great, but I found them to be a little bit more blurry than some other ones that were in this style too. So
right, probably just
yeah.
had to be low res to fit on their cartridge and run
Hmm.
their programming. Um, and the biggest annoyance to me was I kept trying to do fishing, and the fishing is just impossible in Harvest Moon 64. It's fine in SNES, but that was the only thing that I think they took a backward step on, making it just impossible to catch anything. I think I caught two fish after dozens and dozens of tries. Uh, the story, notably, is one area I think they made really dramatic improvements on. What did you think of the story in Harvest Moon 64?
I will say it was still simple, but I think that they did a lot. Like there's a lot more events that you could go and do, and there really was, I feel like, in some ways kind of that um choice in some ways to but that you had a chance to either do like a festival or just stay on your farm, do things like that. But I do like that there was a lot more to it, and there was a lot more happening in the town on any given time. So there was a lot more reason to go into town. There's a lot more um, kind of fun story things to advance. So yeah, I think they improved that too.
I was really impressed how much, like, from virtually no personality in all the townsfolk to a huge variety of personalities.
Hmm.
That there are a lot of people who are grumpy and distracted and just not interested in meeting this new farmer, while others are much friendlier and welcoming. There were there's much more lines of dialogue programmed into this game, so it felt like you were really actually getting drawn into the town this time, where
Hmm.
people warmed up to you and were encouraging and started greeting you like the local farmer as you found your way in this town. Um, I was also really impressed that there were like complex storylines going on outside of your character, where you weren't the center of attention. You'd walk over to the vineyard, and then you'd see a scene of father and daughter in a fight about how they were running the family wine business, and then the daughter would storm off, and like it's just something you're observing as an outsider, and then you can choose to get involved in the wine business and help them out, or you can just leave them to themselves. And I did some research on some of the storylines, and in that particular one, if you don't intervene and help out, then the daughter will eventually get so frustrated that she will move away and leave the game entirely. Conversely,
Wow.
you can help out and you might be able to help heal that relationship a bit. You could eventually marry this person. Somebody else can marry in town. So, like, if you just kind of leave the town on its own, I believe, uh, people will get married and move around and have kids and things like that. So like the town is changing as you play, whether or not you change it as the player, which I thought was very impressive and kind of ahead of its time. Would still be impressive today. And I did really enjoy the festival I attended, the Harvest Festival, I think it was. It was very cute because the whole village gathered together and they like tied bundles of seeds onto a big hot air balloon, and
Yeah.
then they were supposed to like represent their hopes and dreams being sent up into the sky to fall wherever they might land. And it was just kind of this cute little unique tradition that might be in this small farming village that you get to be a part of. And there are, a dozen or so festivals that you get to partake in, including horse races and other fun things.
Hmm.
So I think that was fantastically done on the story side. How would you rate Harvest Moon 64, or any final thoughts you have for it?
Yeah, I would also give it one thumb up,
Okay.
which it was improved and it was a lot more fun. I actually played more of this than I did the Super Nintendo one because I just in some ways got a little bit too frustrated with the Super Nintendo one.
Mhm.
Um, it it still had that kind of aimless feel to me, and so it was hard. Like the different events were great, but it still was hard to figure out like what to do in them or if it really was affecting me in some way. And I think at first, so it was hard for me to get really into the game. So that's why one thumb up. It's something that's worth checking out, I think, but not much more than that, in my opinion.
I I also decided to go with one thumb up. I actually have a harder time recommending Harvest Moon 64,
Hmm.
even though I really loved what they did with the storytelling and the gameplay is improved. Um, it's still pretty rough around the edges, and it doesn't have that same place in history that the original had. And I also visually liked the SNES title more. So for those reasons, it was like if this is a game you're nostalgic for, I think I'm so happy it's there for you on the online
Hmm.
library. But I'm not sure that it is well suited to anyone else. So
Yeah,
while I give it one thumb up, I'm not actually going to say it's worth playing for anyone with the online pass library. How about yourself?
I would agree. It may, or I would say it of like play either the Super Nintendo one or the 64 one, but you don't need to play both.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Again, we'll give it the half point for the nostalgia factor. I know a lot of people still love these games that grew up with them, so if that's the case for you, then I think you will be well served by picking it up again. But we're going to give it a 2.5, just a hair under the SNES title for Harvest Moon 64. With that, we're probably going a bit long on this podcast, so we better wrap it up.
Yeah, a little bit.
You can send questions to two brothers play a game at gmail.com. Find us on Twitter and YouTube at two brothers PAG. Chris does live streams so you can see some of the gameplay of our games and also interact that way. And does covers a few other games as well as occasionally theme parks like Nintendo World at Universal.
Hmm.
Um, Yeah, that's what's going on with us. Please review us on iTunes if you have a chance. And Chris, now that our publishing deal with Natsume has expired, what should we rename our podcast to?
How about mountains are nice?
This is life.